Okay, we'll get started. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to session 6. This one's on vehicle and route assessment. I'm Carl Chua and I have Kerry Planner here with me today. Similar to the previous sessions, this one will be recorded, and if you have any questions, feel free to submit them anytime. I'll probably answer them at the end. Apologies for the last session. We were doing it off-site due to coronavirus restrictions. But I did update the slides as part of the resources. Same as well. If you've had any questions about that last session, just please let me know.
Yeah, Kerry Slater here, Principal Engineer with the NHVR. So we'll be going through today vehicle and route assessment. So the topics will be road needs consent, rights required, when an assessment's required, what are vehicle assessments, route assessments, some examples, some resources and questions. And with regard to questions, we'll type them in. Carl will look after and we'll look at them at the end. If they're against a specific slide, please include the slide number. So we might get started. So the road needs consents. Under the Heavy Vehicle National Law, the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, we must obtain relevant road managed consent before granting restricted access vehicle or RAV access through either a notice or a permit or another thing called an authorisation. So basically we deal with notices and permits. And the sections of the Heavy Vehicle National Law for a Class 1 or 3 vehicle, restricted access vehicles, Section 118 covers consent for a notice, and Section 124 covers consent for a permit. And for a Class 2, which is your B-doubles, road trains, and your PBS type vehicles, Section 139 is for the notice, and Section 145 is the requirements for obtaining consent for a permit. So road manager consents. A road manager may decide not to give consent. So there's a focus in the law on giving consent if you can. So it says not to give consent if satisfied that the mass or dimension authority will or is likely to cause damage to road infrastructure or impose adverse effects on the community from noise, emissions or traffic congestion, so that's public amenity, or pose significant risk to public safety arising from heavy vehicle use that is incompatible with road infrastructure or traffic conditions. So you've got to consider when you're giving consent whether infrastructure, public amenity and public safety considerations mean that the vehicle will or is likely to affect those areas. So there's 3 areas: infrastructure, public amenity, public safety. But what you've also got to consider, next is looking at conditions. So before deciding not to give consent, again, it's looking at you should give consent where you can. The road manager must satisfy itself that it's not possible to grant access subject to road or travel conditions that will avoid or significantly mitigate those relevant risks. So conditions are used to mitigate risks, and there's all sorts of conditions in the portal. There's a whole conditions library there, and basically it says we'll use this condition for this. So some conditions like a road conditions, well, there's actually 3 sorts of conditions in the law. There's vehicle conditions, which we apply, which are lights on vehicles, flashing lights, things like that, which are to make the vehicle safe to operate on the road. There's road conditions, which are generally conditions to protect infrastructure and other public amenity, public safety, and they differ from travel conditions, because travel conditions is basically direction of travel and time of travel as travel conditions. So you apply conditions to avoid or significantly mitigate those relevant risks. So a condition may be do not operate during school bus hours on a school bus route, things like that. Low speed travel over a structure to reduce the dynamic effects on a structure. So they're the sort of things you put on as conditions. Now, there's all sorts of conditions you can use. There's some conditions that aren't suitable, like So we'll talk more about conditions probably later, but basically conditions are there to mitigate the risks, but they've got to be relevant to the risk and they've got to actually mitigate the risk. So if I say I only want yellow trucks as a condition, that's not a relevant condition because it's not mitigating any risks. And if it's because of visibility, it'd be a vehicle condition which would be controlled by the NHVR would apply it. So we're not going to talk too much about conditions because it's such a big topic. So we'll go on to assessments. So when are assessments required? So some form of assessment is required for each consent request. So every time we get a consent request, whether it be for a notice or a permit, it's the level of assessment required that varies. So when you do an assessment, you identify infrastructure, public safety and public amenity risks. And then you consider risk mitigation controls, so conditions to mitigate those risks. So, for example, if you've got a company running B doubles down a certain road which isn't on the B double route, but it's been approved for one company to use those B doubles, if the freight task remains the same, and there's another company that is now sharing in the contract, if there's no increase in the amount of freight being moved or the number of movements on that road, and they're using B doubles, that's very easy form of assessment. If I'm moving a 200-ton transformer down a minor road with some suspect bridges of it, with mod prime movers and everything else, that would be a high level of assessment for that, because there's a. So it depends on the level of assessment. Some are easy, some are hard. The idea is you get the easy ones out of the way by putting them into notices or doing pre-approvals, so you can concentrate your efforts and your time on the ones that have the greater risks. So next. So it's the mindsets. The HVNL promotes safety, productivity and efficiency. So we want safe, productive, efficient vehicles to be used on the road. And so that's what the law is about. And that's why non-consent or conditional consent requires justification. So if you're going to say no, or if you're going to put conditions on to mitigate risks, you actually need to provide some justification for that. So, and it also requires that you have supporting documentation. You don't have to put it in with your consent, but you should have that in place. And that could be you've done a route assessment and it comes back and says, look, the road's not wide enough, or the traffic's too heavy on that road for a particular type of vehicle carried in. That's justification for it. But if you don't provide consent or provide conditional consent, the law actually provides for the operator to be able to have that decision reviewed, which means that's when you'll need your solid justification and your supporting documentation to support your decisions. The other thing you've got to think about is, as road managers, you're actually managing assets and access on behalf of ratepayers, taxpayers, shareholders, if you're something like a airport or a port or something like that, that's a public company. And what they're seeking is optimal utilisation and return on investment. So what they're looking at, most people, is looking at lower costs of goods and services to them, is one of the things they'd be looking at. As an example of that, when PBS truck and dogs were first introduced, what happened was they actually pushed down, because they've got more efficient, have better carrying capacity, especially if they're running at 57 and at higher masses. They actually pushed down, anecdotally anyway, I was told that they pushed down the price per tonne for gravel cartage in the Brisbane area. So what happened was, when it first started off, the ones with PBS vehicles were getting some good return on their investment, but the price actually went down. So it ended up that if you weren't running PBS vehicles, you're actually not making any money. So it's actually promoted a safer, more productive and efficient carting. So, and that goes back to the community. So you can build your roads cheaper, you can build your housing estates cheaper because the cost of gravel cartage has gone down. So it's a mindset that's what you're doing for the community by allowing some of these vehicles is it's actually affecting the community and helping them rather than just providing more profits for a trucking company. And so safe, productive and efficient vehicles, they actually benefit everyone. And the other thing is, in my early days in my engineering career, I actually worked in the patents office. I'm a qualified patents examiner. As part of being a patents examiner, one of the things that was actually stated in your role was you had to be willing and wishing to issue a patent. So you went in with a positive attitude of saying, well, no, yeah, so positive attitude to say, well, I'll try to get this through if I can. If there's big roadblocks, I can't do it. But it's just being willing and wishing to get safe, productive and efficient vehicles on the road and to basically help the community by doing that. So we'll go on to vehicle assessment. So when you're doing a vehicle assessment, you'll say assessment of vehicle impacts. So you consider existing vehicles. So with most, the best thing to think about when you're looking at these vehicles is look at the freight task. So if something needs to be carted and moved around, it's going to be moved around on some sort of vehicle. So a transport task or a freight task. So what are the vehicles that are actually doing that task now? And then you look at the alternative vehicles, which are likely to be the ones that you're looking at on the permit or the notice application. So you say, well, what are the proposed vehicles? And then you do a comparison of the vehicles, of their performance, how much road space, all sorts of things they take up. So you do a comparison. You look at the freight task. Is it a new freight task? What is the commodity? What is the volume of the freight task that's going to be undertaken? Is it seasonal, like in crop harvest, grain harvest, sugarcane harvest? All that. How important is it to the local community? How important is it to the state or the national economy for these things to be moved? Frequency of movement. So how many and how often? Is it once a day? Is it 100 trips a day? Is it one every 3 months? Yeah. Then you look at your vehicle configuration. So you look at what type of vehicle is it? Is it a Class 1? Is it a B-double? Is it a road train? Is it a PBS? What's the axle spacing? What's the axle groups and masses? And what's the dimensions of the vehicles? And then you can look at conditions or vehicle performance, web path and that. And for freight vehicles, you can sort of compare that with PBS performance standards, which show you what sort of vehicles should be allowed and what sort of networks. So we look at conditions for similar movements. So therefore risk mitigation. So yeah, again, there could be things like times of travel, no travel in peak hours for congestion and things like that. Lower speeds for even dust, and structures and things like that, all for safety. So that's what you got to look at. So that's how you look at a vehicle assessment. So it's looking into what the vehicle does, or the vehicle impacts. And we'll go through some worked examples later. The other thing we're going to look at is route assessment. So it's assessment of the physical characteristics of the infrastructure. So you look at the geometric. So you're saying, what's width, what's lane width, what's the curves like, are there passing opportunities, is there intersections, is there interaction with rail or some other things? What's the design? Okay, so with structures, span, design, construction, age, existing vehicles, pavements. So you're looking, what's the pavement design or lack of pavement as in unsealed roads? What's the width? What's the available room on there? So then we can look at the condition of the structures of pavements. So you can, is it wear? Are we concerned about pavement wear? Are we concerned about damage that already exists? No. Are repairs needed? Does it need instruction? Is it up to date? Are the inspections up to date on that thing? But so we're looking at those sort of things. Now, if you happen to be in Tasmania, a lot of this stuff has already been done, or this investigation through the work that the local government association, Tasmania and Department of State Growth have worked with the local governments down there to look at the infrastructure and its capabilities. So at the moment, it's mainly for Class 1 vehicles, load carrying SPV, which operate under a notice arrangement, where you basically put in what vehicle you're going to use, and it tells the operator where he can go because they've already agreed on the capability of the network. So I think they're looking at moving over to going into the freight vehicle space with that as well. So if you're in Tasmania as a local government, in Tasmania, you're well looked after in that case. So we go on to traffic volumes. So you look at what is your volume of traffic? Is it so AABT, heavy traffic, light traffic. You look at the traffic mix. Is there a lot of heavy vehicles? Is it in an industrial area? Is there a lot of light vehicles? Are there school buses in there? tourists, the grey nomads, could be an issue in some places. Mining, is it a mining area where people are used to large loads of heavy vehicles? Is an agricultural area where you get the expectations of agricultural equipment being on the road. So then we look at the speed environment. Is it urban? Is it a rural speed environment? High speed or a restricted speed environment? So all these things are part of your route assessment. And then you have your local expectations. So if you're in agricultural areas, there's expectations for farmers to be able to get their produce off the land, be able to have their supplies and requirements come in, and also be able to operate some of their agricultural equipment to satisfy their needs moving between paddocks and between holdings and things like that. Cost of living, local expectations, that's the cost of living, the price of their groceries, and that is kept to a minimum, and yes, they can be. So does that help with the route assessment? Am I able to provide some cost of living relief by allowing certain vehicles? And also lifestyle. Now this could come into areas where people have moved into an area expecting peace and quiet, but there's a heavy vehicle task that may or may have not existed previously. So there's some expectations the other way that may say, look, this affects the public amenity. So there's sort of things we need to look at. So we're going to go through a couple of examples here. So the first thing is truck and dog trailers, very common. They've been running around forever.
Yeah, majority under notice.
Most of them run under notice, and have run under notice for a long time prior to the HVNL being in, and a long time prior to PBS being in. And then we have a look at A-doubles, which is probably one of the most efficient PBS vehicles that are around, and they're providing really good safety, productivity and efficiency benefits through the use of those. Then we look at the Class 1 oversized, overmass load carrying vehicles and the SPVs, or special purpose vehicles. And again, a lot of these things have been running under notice, basically since the mid-90s. So again, they're fairly low risk compared to some of the others. And just some comments on major projects and how road access is affected by those, by major projects. So going to truck and dog trailer, top left there, that's general access truck and dog that runs under the 19-metre truck and dog notice, maximum 50.5 tonne, and they get general access in most jurisdictions, or basically general access in all jurisdictions, with a few restrictions in some. So they've been in for a long time, running at that. Below that we have a PBS truck and dog. Maximum length they can go up to 20 metres long. Maximum mass at level 1 is 50.5 tonne, and at level 2 is 56 tonne at GML, or 57.5 tonne at CML. So these have, at level 1 under the PBS truck and dog notice, you're looking at basically general access for those.
Equivalent.
Yeah, similar to the prescriptive truck and dog at 19 metres long. Level 2, they basically get access to the B-double routes generally, but that's under the truck and dog, PBS truck and dog notice as well. So next slide, we're looking at the differences between the two vehicles. And this is an actual technical results table that is submitted by the PBS assessors, where they've actually done, and it's usually a desktop computer analysis of the performance of these vehicles. So they set the vehicles up, run it through, the computer program runs through all the tests that are there for the different performance standards and comes out with results. Now, the way PBS works, if I don't comply in any of these characteristics with the level that I'm supposed to, I then jump up to the next level or whichever level I comply with. So we start up the top there. The two middle columns, you've got the left column there has got 50.5 tonne, so level 1, and the other column's got 57.5 tonne, level 2. So we go to the first safety standard, it says startability. Now, under the PBS standards, PBS level 1, you have to have startability, which is the ability to start on a grade of 15%. So at 50.5 tonne, it's 16.1%, so that's better than 15%, so it meets level 1 requirements. However, at 57.5 tonne, it's 14.1%, so less than 1% below the standard, but it becomes a level 2 vehicle because of its great startability. So the standard for level 2 is 12%. And this comes back to when you're assessing, applying route assessment guidelines, it says level 1, level 2 routes are up to 12% grade, and level 1 routes are up of 15%.
Bit higher, yeah.
So if we go down maximum grades, they both meet, it meets level 1 at both masses. Speed on a 1% grade is, they meet the requirements for level 1 for both those. We go to acceleration capacity, and this is a measure of ability to clear intersection, things like that. So under the performance standards, to be level 1, you've got to be able to accelerate from, so go from a standing start and travel 100 metres in no more than 20 seconds. Okay, and for level 2, it's 23 seconds. So as you see there, this particular truck and dog at 57.5 tonne is 20.3 seconds. So it's 0.3 of a second outside the requirements for PBS, and so it's therefore level 2. Okay, and then if we go down, tracking ability in a straight path, very much the same. Both meet level 1. Low speed swept path is exactly the same. Same for frontal swing, maximum difference maximum, which is basically how much the front and rear, the different travel paths for the front and rear of the vehicle. Tail swing is 0.07 metres, which is level 1 for both of them. Steer tyre friction demand, 23%, so we pass the requirements. Static rollover threshold, worst case, is exactly the same. Of the last unit, there's slightly more chance of rolling, but it's still, it's 0.46 G gives 0.447, which is well above the 0.35 that is required by PBS. Rearward amplification, so it's slightly more, but it still passes level 1 from previous levels. High speed transient off braking. Now, the interesting thing about this is a test that's carried out at 88 kilometres an hour. That's why it's called high speed. And it's basically what Liz Bruiser, Chief Engineer, calls the Doppler Bayesian test. So it's a pulse input, so you flick steering wheel right, steering wheel left, and see how much, and what it is how much the big trailer swings out. So you've got a 50 mil difference there. But because it's over 0.6, which is the PBS level 1 standard, it becomes a level 2 vehicle. So your dampings, okay. When we go down to bridge loading, tier 1, but it's at 50.5 tonne, it means level 1 tier 1, so it's equal to a general access vehicle. At 57.5, it means level 2 tier 1, which means it's equivalent to a B double bridge loading. So as you can see there, there's only a couple of things that would affect whether the performance of this vehicle. So we've got 4 things. So you'd have concerns when you're doing for this vehicle, you'd have concerns where there's grades greater than 14%, where you've got concerns about signal timing at intersections. So it's going to take a little bit, 0.7 of a second longer to cross. You have to consider whether that's an issue.
Or if it even applies.
Or if it even applies. So if there's no application, again, if there's no steep grades, that doesn't even apply. And your high-speed transient off-tracking, the issue there is in a high-speed, in a low-speed environment, so if it's in an urban area, or you've not, with speed, 60k or something like that, it's not a concern. So that way you can look at it and say, well, I need to look at these areas when I do my route assessment. And your bridge loading, you've got to consider the level 2 tier 1 as a basically the same effects as a B double. So if your route's good for B doubles, your route will be good for this sort of vehicle. So the next thing we look at, so this is our track impact chart, the Australian Trucking Association truck impact chart, which we'll be including as resources. So just an extract out of it. So the thing with a freight task, it's got to be moved. So what this basically goes through and tells you what are the effects, basically in trips and ESAs, and the truck impact chart has all sorts of other things like emissions and everything else that goes through and explain the effect of different vehicle combinations. So basically, going from the top, if I did the same freight task with the 3-axle truck, I need 74 trips to move 1,000 tonnes, and I do 347 ESAs, equivalent standard axles, of pavement wear during that time. If I go to a semi at GML, I get 42 trips, 304 ESAs per 1,000 tonnes. At HML, I reduce my number of trips down to 37 and 268. So I'll go to 50.5 tonnes for axle truck and dog, be it PBS or prescriptive. We get down to 30 trips and 234 ESAs. If I go to level 2 GML, so I'm now running at 56 tonne, I get 26 trips, so I reduce the number of trips, but I increase the ESAs. And similarly, if I do it with a 19 metre B double, I've got 28 trips, and that's because of the higher tier mass of the B double. And my ESAs also go up because I'm doing more trips, 278 per 1,000 tonnes. If I go to the 57.5 tonne, I drop down to 25 trips per 1,000 tonnes. So I've reduced my trips, but my ESAs have increased slightly over a 50.5 tonne. So what we'll do go through and look at the vehicle assessment. So what are your existing vehicles? Truck and dogs at 50.5 tonne. Alternative vehicles, a PBS level 2 truck and dogs at 57.5 tonne. Comparison, we're going to look at bridge effects because it's higher loading for structures because it beats the basically B double. You'll have the effect of B doubles on bridges. We're going to look at high speed because the high speed transient off tracking could be an issue. It's only 50 mil in this case, worse than level 1. So is that really a concern or not? No, it's not a lot. And then we'll look at if we've got steep grades, we could have issues. Freight task, it will be the existing unchanged freight task. The freight task hasn't changed. Number and frequency of movements, so you've got about 20% less movements. Okay, vehicle configuration is similar, so swept path is similar. Conditions for similar movements of this alternative vehicle would be on the B double network because of the masses and because it's level 2. So that's why we look at that for vehicle assessment. So if we do a route assessment, the performance of the two vehicles is similar. Structures, we're going to look at B double loading on the structures. If we assess it, so we can do a if it's suitable for B doubles and suitable for this. Payments, it's 6% greater ESAs, and you'll see in the later one we do with in a number of examples, we're looking at A doubles and B doubles. That actually goes the opposite way. That's because truck and 4-axle dogs have tandem axle groups, and they're actually more damaging than tri-axle groups, especially at HML. Condition of the assets or the infrastructure, well, that's unchanged. It's asset specific. So just because we change vehicles doesn't mean the assets have changed. Traffic volumes, well, traffic volumes reduced. We've got probably 20% less to do that freight task. So the traffic mix got less heavy vehicles, speed environments unchanged, local expectations, less traffic, less trucks, and reduced costs because my transport costs go down. So especially with these, things like gravel cartage, there's been reduction in costs for all things. All right. So that's just an example of how it goes through. We'll do the same thing with the 30 metre PBS level 2B A double. 30 metres in length, gross mass is 79.5 tonne at GML or 85.5 tonne at HML. B double's length, 26 metres, gross mass 63 tonnes GML and 68.5 HML. So, okay, so this was an actual case that we were asked to look at. So we're just doing the route assessment side of this with the vehicle assessment as before. So the task was to transport 150 megalitres, so that's 150 million litres of water per annum, so 150,000 tonnes of water. Someone was thirsty. So we looked at vehicles had a B double at GML, configuration 1233. Number of trips to do that movement, 3,900. ESAs, 33,600 ESAs for that transport, that freight task per year. So we go to 68.5. Same configuration, we've reduced the trips by 450 and we've reduced the ESAs by 24,000. If we go to an A double, we reduce at GML, we reduce the trips by another 300. However, our ESAs are slightly greater than the B double, 3375 at GML, and at 85 HML, and that's because we've got an extra tier to maximum group in there. So we reduced the number of trips by another 300, and yes, that is a 30.60, which just over 30,000, which is better than the B double at GML, but not quite as good as the B double at HML. So generally, there's less payment wear at HML for the given freight task because we're using triangle groups. The payment impact is slightly greater, up to 3% at HML using A doubles compared to B doubles. But you're looking at somewhere between 300 and 1,050 less trips per year with A doubles. So you reduce congestion, emissions, and other public safety and amenity issues because of the reduction in trips. All right. So we'll work our way through it. So your existing vehicles, the B doubles, your alternative vehicles, the PBS 2BA doubles. What's the comparison? Your bridge effects are going to be greater. Most of these are tier 2, tier 3 rather than tier 1 at those masses. Your length may be an issue, and that's an issue at intersections. Clearing intersections, because although your acceleration is the same, because you're still going to meet the PBS level 2 standard, because you're slightly longer, you take slightly, because your vehicle is slightly longer, you take a longer time to transverse, clear that intersection. There's look at issues with stacking, especially at railway crossings and at intersections. And then there's overtaking provisions may need to be increased or may need to be looked at if you're in a high-speed environment where they've got overtaking lanes and things like that, or overtaking opportunities. But for most local authorities on your major roads, it's probably not a big local authority issue because generally these be looking at last mile access. The freight task, that should say existing, but it says exiting, and it should be unchanged. Number and frequency of movements. We've got 600 to 750, which is different to before, but that's because we've actually looked at comparing GML with GML. So GML B double against the GML A double. That's working on the principle that if the route isn't HML approved, it's unlikely to get HML for either of those. Or if it is HML approved, you get you'd be using HML B doubles, so you compare it with HML A doubles. So you're looking at 600 to 750 less movements a year, and that's And what is the axle configuration? You got more axles, which means you spread the load more. But if you have got a higher load, your vehicle performance will be similar because it meets level 2 requirements. So your swept path, all those sort of things are the same, similar. And conditions for similar movements will be on the B double network or approved A double network. Okay. So geometric, they're similar, they have similar performance apart from your length of the vehicle. Structures, you'll probably have them greater than B double loading because you're running in tier 2, tier 3, unless you're running reduced loading. Payments, there's up to 3% greater ESAs for HMO loading than you would with the B double, so there's a slight increase in that. So you condition again is unchanged, that's specific. Traffic volumes reduced by over 20% for that freight task. So GML, if you're running a GML, you get about 24% less truck movements, and HML you get 21%. Speed environment is unchanged. Traffic mix, you get less heavy vehicles, even though the ones, but they may be slightly longer. So local expectations, less traffic, less trucks, reduced cost. So again, it's just a way of looking through to see what, when you're doing your assessments, and some you can just, speed environments are changed, so you don't worry about it. So
these are just considerations.
Considerations, yeah, what you should be looking at, and just some examples of having a look at it. So the next one we'll move on to is we're looking at our Class 1 OSOM vehicles. So they range from extreme, which up the top is, it looks like a transformer, which they move around. This sort of, gone on a few of those movements. So what it's got in the middle there, it's got what they call a beam set. So you've got transformers, the white thing in the middle. So the two green arms are called beam sets, and they're supported on, and it's supported on each end by a 12-row of 8 platform trailer. So they're drawn platforms. So there's one at the front, one at the front. Yep. And there's one at the rear, and if you have a look at the one at the rear, there's a little white box sitting on it. There's a person sits in that when they're going in tight areas, like through residential areas or urban areas. He'll sit there and manually steer the axles on the platform so that can clear intersections and things like that. But that's at very low speed. But this one looks like it's out in the open highway, and we've got 1, 2, 3 prime movers pulling it, and 2 prime movers pushing it. That transformer's probably around, they're not around, up around 200 tonnes for the transformer itself. You're probably looking at another 150, 160 tonne for the platforms and the beam sets, and we're looking at the prime movers, the trucks, they're probably 25 tonne each. So in total, you've probably got somewhere around 480, 490 tonnes in that combination of, and it could be up to anything up to about 60, 70, 80 metres long. But they can negotiate with all steerable axles, negotiate all sorts of things. So each axle there is probably, it's got 4 tyres. 4 tyres per axle is probably somewhere around 15 tonne a line. But it's got plenty, so there's 96 tyres on the first platform and 96 tyres on the rear platform. So there's plenty of tyres to support the weight and spread across the road and structures. But there's obviously permit required for that, and that'd take a lot of assessment to make sure that's capable of travelling on the roads. But the good thing about these movements, they don't really on one day and say, I want this tomorrow. They're usually long-term, well in advance, they have to organise everything. And yeah, and the one on the right beside that is the house movement. The interesting things about houses is they're actually fairly light, they're not heavy, because they're full of air. Mainly inside the house. Houses aren't heavy. but they are big.
Yeah, so it's just dimension.
Yeah, dimension, and yeah, and there's some other issues with them. That's how you tie them down properly and all sorts of things, which is more of a regulatory straight issue. So width is the main thing. Width and height is the main thing with houses. So those ones at the top there, along the first row, would both be permits. The maximum width you can go under notice for the house movement is 5.5 metres, and that'd be well over that. So the next we got down the one down the bottom, they all operate under notices. So prime mover, quad axle trailer with 4 tyres per axle. Travel under notice in every jurisdiction. Very common. The one on the, so you've got a truck with plastic water tanks on it, poly water tanks on it. So it's obviously very light. It's only a single axle truck and a single truck and a single axle trailer. But they're wide and possibly high. So you don't have to worry about structures or anything like that. It's just dimension wide. And the one on the bottom, quite common, just moving side huts around, which are usually wider than 2.5. And that's just a normal tilt tray. So they all operate under notice. So if you're getting permit applications for those sort of vehicles, or ones that are applicable for a notice and you've approved them, you're best off saying, well, I want to add this route to the notice, especially if there's in industrial areas or there's a known industry on there that's going to be using it regularly. That'll save you some time and effort, so you can play with the big things up the top. Okay, so we go on to vehicle assessment. For these, it's probably best to look at the Class 1 OSOM notices. So
yeah, the multi-state.
Yeah, the multi-state.
Load carrying, Class 1 load carrying vehicle. Mass.
There's a mass exemption notice and there's the dimension exemption notice. You look at them and they're what the jurisdictions have agreed to. Basically, they've been running around since the mid-90s with those massive weights we had a session on before. So then your alternative vehicle varies. If it complies with the notice, it's quite easy. If it's outside the notice, then you'll have to do some bit more looking into it to see what affects. It could be like in that house movement. It's not heavy, so it's complied with notices for masses. It's just the dimensions. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. Comparison. So you're going to compare one vehicle they put against the vehicles that are existing in the notices to see what the differences are. Usually there's specific freight tasks. So they'll take a large individual item or something else from one place to the other. They normally return empty, except mainly with some of the mining industry or equipment delivery, even farming implements or farming equipment. They may take a new vehicle out or a new piece of machinery out and return with the old piece. So, but normally there's specific freight tasks are generally one way. Number and frequency of movements, so they're generally low, except if there's a major project or something going on, like a wind farm, but we talk about that later. So they're generally one-off movements to deliver something. Vehicle configuration varies, but again, you can compare it with the Class 1 notice vehicles. And their performance varies, but again, there's probably similar vehicles in the Class 1 notices. And conditions for similar movements. We look at the notice conditions and say, well, yeah, it's the same size and mass as that, or it's slightly bigger, but it complies with the mass requirements, so we pick up the conditions out of the notice to do that. All right. Route assessment for Class 1 OSOM vehicles. I like to talk about the size of the whole of the infrastructure. So if I've got that house that we looked at before, and it is 7 metres wide and 5 metres high, I have to make sure that there's a whole of the infrastructure at least 7 metres high and 7 metres wide and 5 metres high, plus some allowance for wobble to allow that thing to go down the road. Now, with those house removal trailers and a lot of the low loaders on hydraulics, they can actually lift the load to clear bridge railings and things like that. So there is conditions that you must lift your load to clear any bridge railings. If you've got a smaller, if you've got a, say, a bridge with bridge railings, that's and the bridge is only 6 metres wide, the house is 7 metres wide, those particular house trailers can lift up to about 3 metres off the ground, so they're pretty good. But if you've got something enclosed to the bridge, that won't do you any good. So you look at the size of the whole infrastructure, considering when you're going around corners and things like that, you may need more room to cater for the turning effect of the vehicles and swept paths and things like that. The other thing is Schedule 8, which is the mass dimensional loading regulations. Schedule 8 has a requirement that the operator must basically scope the route to make sure they're not going to run anything, but that's only if they're running under notices. So, but you can include that on a permit, that they make sure they scope the route to make sure it's suitable. It doesn't stop you from, if you know there's a problem, of saying there's a problem here, we don't think you can cut it. And you know, it could be things like you ask them to clear trees, do sort of things like that as part of your conditions of operation to allow it to go. Structures for the heavier masses, it's covered by the notice and you haven't got any heavier masses on it, you would need to assess the structures as long as their condition is that good. But if they're heavier masses, you may want to say, well, we need to have a look at the structures on that route. Pavements, as discussed in the previous, I used to think about the Nazareth work that was done back in the early 80s, that the actual pavement loading, because they have so many tyres and axles and things like that, is similar to the notice vehicles. It's only if you went over those loadings and the notices that your pavement loading would be affected. Conditions, so that's asset specific. If you know you've got dodgy bridges or a dodgy road, or you can either condition it or refuse it or look at alternative routes. So traffic volumes, for your traffic volumes, a lot of that's controlled by travel times, like in the notice, wide loads or oversized loads basically there from travelling in peak hours. Some places it'd be from travelling on weekends and things like that. So, but then you've got pilots and escorts which help control whatever traffic volumes you need. So basically for oversize, over mass, pilots and escorts come in if you're over 3.5 metres wide or over 26 metres long. Yeah. Is when you start using pilots and escorts. There's all sorts of controls over that. Now the traffic mix, again, your pilots and escorts, your travel times can be used to control them. So in the speed environment, you may be operating at a reduced speed, which again, pilots and escorts are required. And local expectations, they want infrastructure to be built, but they also want infrastructure to be protected. They like to see local development going on. So developing which helps the local economy, but they're also interested in safety. Mostly safety is looked after by your conditions for your pilots and escorts and things like that.
SPVs.
Next one's Class 1 special purpose vehicles. So if we look at the top one, It's a 6-axle all-terrain crane. So that one doesn't run under notice, it runs under permit. So it's probably up to 72 tonne, 12 tonne an axle is how it come out of the factory, usually in Germany. So that one, because of its short length, is very concentrated load. So the main issue with that probably structural, your structures. Particularly some of the longer span ones. So the next 4, your fire engine, your concrete pump, your pick and carry crane, and your earth moving equipment operator at the bottom, they can all operate under notice. So if you're getting permits for those sort of things and you're ticking off the permits, it'd be probably pertinent to look at getting whatever route you're using. Again, routes to depots and routes to places they usually go. They can be a bit all over the place, especially cranes. You can add the route to the notice if it's suitable.
Yeah, so they can just run it for notice.
Yeah, and then you won't get all the permit applications and consent requests because you give them consent. So vehicle assessment. So you look at the Class 1 SPV notices, if they comply with those. They're alternative vehicles, it varies. RLC, it varies. They don't actually have a freight task, they have a task, and it's usually a service task. So what they do is they will go and supply, especially with cranes, they'll go do a job and go to another job or go back home. So again, they're to site, then back, and especially with the bigger cranes, they'll go to site and they'll stay there for 6 months and then they'll go home. So it's not, so number and frequency of movements is generally low, and same with the concrete pumps. They'll go to site, work on site, then go home. And concrete pumps, concrete trucks come to them, fill them up, and they just pump the concrete. Vehicle configuration varies, vehicle performance, swept path varies. Generally with special purpose vehicles, they're either based on existing trucks, like a concrete pump, or they're built specifically like a lot of the cranes, but they're actually road space they take up with their swept path, and that they're normally fairly compact, and their performance is very similar except for width usually. And we're overhang to a general access large truck. So the road space requirements, they may be a bit wider, but apart from that, they're pretty much similar to normal road going vehicles. Their main problem is they get heavy. So conditions for similar movements, I'd be looking at the notice conditions to see what conditions apply to similar vehicles. The Class 1 SPV, National SPV notice covers up to 40 tonne.
Yeah.
But there's other notices in other jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Tasmania and Victoria, which cover bigger vehicles.
Yeah, I think New South Wales as well.
Yeah, 3, 4 and 5 axle train cranes, up to 60 tonne. So
yeah, similar to the other Class 1 stuff, like the LCD load carrying vehicles. I think New South Wales has a notice that allows you to go a little bit more.
Yeah,
yeah.
So up over 100 tonne. Okay.
Right.
So the route assessment. Geometrically, the length of the vehicles can be longer than general vehicles, and their width are a little bit wider. So with structures, you have assessment for heavier masses than what's allowed under the notice. If notice vehicles are allowed to travel across it. Pavements are similar loading. This goes back to the work done in the early 80s, national work. Asset-specific conditions, traffic volumes, there's controls on travel times, when they move, so you can control them so they're not running around in peak hour traffic. Because even though they're not much bigger than a normal vehicle, they actually scare people. I've actually had cases of following big cranes because we're looking at slowing them down to cross bridges and see what effects that had with the Gateway motorway in Brisbane. And they were travelling in lane, and there was people at 80 kilometres an hour, and there was people refusing to overtake them because they were intimidated by the width of the vehicle. So even though they were completely in lane, but they had flashing lights and they had an escort vehicle with them, so they refused to overtake them, and there was a full lane for them to do it in. So it was interesting how some people react to it. So you probably don't want them running around in peak hour traffic. Speed environment, they're usually travelling at a reduced speed. So like an all-terrain crane, basically most of those cranes and things like that, concrete pumps are okay, they're based on normal trucks. Most cranes are probably around 80, 85k maximum speed. Again, local expectations, they need their infrastructure built. They want development of the
High rise.
anything. Yeah. So they want development of local development, means local jobs, all sorts of things. But again, they're interested in safety, so you've got to weigh them up against each other. So, okay. So the next thing we get on to, as with most of these things, this is high level. We can give you more detail later if you need to. But if you've got major projects, in this case, we're looking at something like a wind farm. So you've got, we'll do it in chronological order. How about that? So first thing you do is the top right. We get all the concrete pumps out there and all the concrete trucks, and we build a base to put our wind turbine on. We go to the bottom picture, we then take the parts out to the side. So that first one with the concrete pumps, special purpose vehicles. Then next thing we do, we take the bits and pieces out there. This is a class 1 oversized overmass vehicle, taking a turbine blade, and then we go to sites, and then we've got more special purpose vehicles or cranes to erect the turbine. So what we'll talk about in this, we've got SPVs and load carrying vehicles, all sorts of things helping out. So if we look at major projects, they have a bit of a life cycle. Now, the best thing, so the first thing is your planning. And this is where you can look at infrastructure upgrades and funding arrangements. So I've found in my working my career, especially I spent a lot of time in Queensland looking after the class 1 vehicles in Queensland, that quite often there's a mismatch between the infrastructure upgrades that are needed, the funding arrangement in the planning stages of major projects, and considering how do we get all the stuff there and how do we do it. The transport and the actual physical movement of things to and from site. There was a classic one up in North Queensland where they decided we're going to replace the bridges on this particular road because they're old timber bridges, we're going to replace them all. And so there was only one access into this road, it was going north, and there was no other major roads to get to it. So they decided, we'll plan all this, we'll replace the most northerly bridge first. Then they went to get the equipment there, the cranes and everything to replace the bridge, and found out that they couldn't cross the most southerly bridge or any of the ones in between to get to the most northerly bridge to fix it. So there's things like that that aren't considered when they plan these things. So they have built bypasses around about 4 bridges to get to the one that they wanted to fix. And then they replaced the ones as they came back along. So it's good to get in as road managers, or it's good to take into account the actual transport tasks that's required to not only build but also to maintain and to operate these major projects. So the first part is infrastructure upgrades. So if this is going in, do I need are infrastructure upgrades needed? 1, to build the thing, and 2, to operate it. And what are the funding arrangements? Can I get money in at that time as part of the development approval to upgrade the infrastructure so it's suitable for the freight tasks that will come out of that thing? The next thing is construction. So there'll be increased traffic to the site. Materials and the workforce is going to come in and out, and you'll probably have a lot of oversize, overmass, and special purpose vehicle movements. So they're got to be considered. There's plenty of times they're going to build something and you can't access it with the vehicles you need to actually build the thing. So it's just getting you to think ahead with any major developments that are going on within your area. The next one is operation and maintenance. So that tends to be a consistent freight task. It could be raw materials in and finished materials out, or it could just be waste out, or it could just be, if it's a power station, it could just be raw materials in, empty travel out. So it can all happen. So you've got to work out what is that freight, but it'll be a consistent freight task. And if it's a major thing, it's probably, if it's major infrastructure, it'll be probably 24/7 freight operation. The other things you've got to consider that is there'll also need some OSOM SPV movements for maintenance. So if I've got a wind farm, I need to get in some pretty big cranes and some pretty big elevating work platforms to do maintenance of that on these things. So we're going to consider that as part of it. Now, with regard to operation and maintenance, the Western Australia Local Government Association worked with ARB, and they developed a thing called recovering the cost of road wear from heavy vehicles. So it's incremental cost impact of additional freight tasks. And this is specifically for new developments. There's a new mine goes in. What effect will the additional freight tasks have on the access roads to that mine and local roads or local authority roads? So it's actually available on the Wolga website, and we'll give a link to it when we go out. But it's for unsealed and sealed roads. Now it's Western Australia specific road types or areas, and they talk about dry and wet areas and things like that. So needs a bit of, so you can look at that and see if it applies in your area. What you can do there, you can say, well, we know that the operation of this facility, this new facility, has given us a new freight task. They're carting my raw materials in, or if it's a mine, carting product out, and you can estimate the cost. So you can include that in your operating agreement or or put it into your maintenance funds, and you can actually ask them, the operator of the mine or whatever it is, to say, look, we need you to contribute to this. This is the estimated cost of that. Now, those sort of arrangements for doing that are probably outside the HPNL and HPR, but it gives you some idea of what it's going to cost you to have that facility there, and so the local community isn't paying for that operation, which may, in some cases, not be benefiting them at all, especially fly-in, fly-out workers and that. So that's the operation and maintenance side, and in the future, when they start to decommission these things, you'll have OSOM and SPV movements to
remove and take down
and remove little equipment. So it's just, if you have got major projects coming up or you're aware of, just think there's a full life cycle to them. It's not just a one-off build them and then nothing else happens. There's still going to be need for use of your roads all through the life of the project. Okay.
So sort of almost at the end.
Yeah. So for these major projects, basically you just look at the examples we gave them before, look at freight vehicle examples, what you would consider, look at their Class 1 examples for SPV and OSOM to see what is required for that. So the vehicle assessment the same. With the route assessment again, compare it, look at the previous examples and how you compare the freight examples and the Class 1 examples. So I think that's okay. Some resources for vehicle assessment. So there's the ministerial guidelines for community access.
Yeah. I think some of these I've sent earlier on, but I'll still I'll link them in the resources.
Yeah.
Because I think we had some issues where the email was too big.
Okay. So there's the PBS scheme vehicle assessment rules. Introduction for road managers, which was produced by the NHVR. ATA truck impact chart, Class 1 OSOM and SPV notices or permits that are available from our website, particular one. And then you've got your state-based vehicle assessment, access guidelines and policies for vehicles. So each individual state's got that, and then the resources for route assessments, again, ministerial guidelines for granting access, PBS scheme network classification guidelines, state-based route assessment guidelines. Most of them states have their own ones, and there's actually an OSRO's project to identify those, which is AP 629-20, framework and tools for road freight access conditions. There's the PBS network classification guidelines for local government. There's the ARB online restricted access vehicle route assessment tool, and the WOLGA stuff, recovering the cost of road wear from heavy vehicles. And I think that's about all, isn't it, Carl?
That's quite, yeah, I think we're done here. We do have a few questions here. I might just run through.
You want to go through next?
Yeah, so next, the next session will be a fortnight from now. It'll kind of be a different one. It'll be the NHVR project's strategic local government asset assessment project. We'll have the project managers and staff from that team come in, so we give an update on that project. We'll also have Dr. Neil Lake from IPWIA Queensland, who will speak about structural assessment. And I think I'll be with him in the room, and it'll be a similar setup to this. If you do have any questions, we'll probably do it the same way how we've been running all the other sessions. But they'll be doing the majority of the presentation.
Yeah.
It'll be, yeah. Do you want to go to the questions? Or?
Oh, we can go to questions.
Yeah, you're here. So I've got one from here from Abhishek. It's about an 80 triple, and I think it's about vehicle manoeuvring in swept path. I think I might be able to get in touch with you directly on how to. We may be able to assess you with that. It's because we do have some software here for swept paths. If you don't mind, I might contact you directly. Another one, can we have operators nominate frequency of movements, especially for the period codes?
You can ask an operator to nominate frequency of movement, but how do you check it? How do you, and is it, and what is the reasoning behind it? What risk are you getting? Is probably my question back to that. So if it's just to know, is it because you've got a structure that's that is borderline and you want to know how many movements across it? Because you're not going to know what other vehicles cross it, so it's very hard to tie it back to the individual vehicle anyway, or the individual operation. But you can, but I think the issue is what are you trying to achieve out of putting that on, because it's hard to enforce and probably hard to justify as well.
I have one here. It's about the PDS results, more of a general question.
Yep.
So here it's, how do we apply this to a vehicle with independent rear triaxle steering? So I think it's more if the vehicle had steerable axles, what results would improve, or what would change?
The results, see, with steerable axles, well, there will still be a set of results tables for that, and I believe we can get them through the portal now, or they are available to road managers. We'll check to see if they're available through the portal, or if you've got to go through another way of getting them. But what it'll come out is, it'll be whatever level performance standard it meets. And having steerable axles helps with low speed, slow path, things like that. The thing with steerable axles, they're set up so they lock up at higher speeds. Most of them are. So it's not going to affect you. You're not going to have a trailer wobbling down the road at high speed because the axles, they're not like a shopping trolley, they actually lock up. So in that question, if you give us some individual example, we'll be able to get the technical results tables for you.
Yep. Got some of your comments here, Bruce. With the example for the water movement.
Yep.
Do you know if that was a case study or where that was?
It was actually, it's a case study. It was actually a request from from one of the a road manager, a local authority road manager.
Another one here, can the road manager ask the applicant for transport route assessment and in what format?
Via route assessment, what do you, sorry. Under the law, you can ask for an assessment to be done of a route. It's usually structural, it's normally structural assessments, but it could be pavement assessment or width assessment. And what happens is you come back to the NHVR, tell them that you need a route assessment be taken. The NHVR can put an extension on time to allow that to be undertaken. You, at that time, would give an estimate of the costs for doing it, or recommend someone to do it, and that goes to the operator. If they agree to have the assessment done, you can charge them for the assessment as long as it's reasonable costs. And yeah, you can ask them to get an assessment done if you want. And all that's covered, I think, in the ministerial guidelines for granting access about asking for route assessments, the undertaking. But they can only be for infrastructure, as far as I understand.
Got a question here from Anne-Marie. What if the applicant said they will use a PDS vehicle, but they actually use another vehicle with more pavement impact? How can we monitor and enforce the application?
If you're aware of something like that happening, you just tell us and we'll get the compliance people to look into it. But yeah, because the permit or whatever you issue will be issued to the that VA to the vehicles listed on that.
Yeah.
If they're operating another permit doing the same freight task and they're a restricted access vehicle, if they're not complying, they're in breach of the law.
Breach of the permit, yeah. We'll just pass that on to our compliance.
Yeah, so if you're aware of anything like that happening, you can send it to us.
Yep, that was
We'll do that.
Cairns Regional Council. Just one for you. Cranes holding up the traffic if the road speed is 100. What is the suitable travel times for cranes avoiding peak hours? I think the restrictions are in the notice, hey?
In the
For
notice,
travel times.
it's generally depending what state you're in.
Depends, yeah.
But usually it's peak hours. In most states it's between 7 and 9.
Yeah. I can
And
send you
between
those
4 and
directly.
6, but we can give you links to it.
Yeah.
And if you need to say they travel at other times, you can put that if it's a particular local issue, high volumes at other times of the day.
That's what we have. That's it for now. If there's anything else, I mean, email us or give us a call. There are a few on here which, yeah, in relation to the AV triple, I'll get in touch with you directly. That one might be easier.
Yeah.
Again, thanks again, guys, for
Just one more comment. If you've got any routes where you're getting a lot of permits for the same sort of vehicle, and you're happy for them to travel with or without conditions, have a talk, see if you can move them over to a notice or even do a pre-approval just to cut down your workload so you can concentrate on the important things, the ones that are higher risk. Just a comment. Right.
all right.
Thank you very much.
I'll probably send out the resources by the end of the week. It just takes some time because we have to get this recording uploaded to YouTube and whatnot. And I'll send out the next Eventbrite invitation soon. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.